Alright, so ladies and gentlemen, last time we learned about the Renaissance and the medieval period of music. Today we're going to be learning first about the Baroque period and then a little bit about the classical period of Western art music. And the Baroque period takes place from 1600 to 1760, so the end of the Renaissance to the beginning of the classical period. And the time is known for just generally everything is very ostentatious. It's very overly decorated. There's men wearing powdered wigs, right? Um, there is music is starting to be considered a high art in Europe, like fancy paintings and sculptures. And musicians worked in cathedrals or were hired by rich patrons to entertain them at parties or other social gatherings. So basically, the music scene is very similar to the Renaissance, but people are starting to bring famous musicians or good musicians into their homes. This is a very famous composer named Johann Sebastian Bach, and he's probably one of the most important composers of all time. But true story, he had 20 children, which I always find very interesting. The Baroque period saw many innovations in music. The opera, for example, was invented. And the orchestra was widely expanded to use strings like the violin, the viola, the cello, and bass. Keyboard instruments became very popular. Like, check out this painting. You see this guy's playing a harpsichord here. These guys are definitely playing cellos and violins, and someone's playing a flute or a piccolo. And soloists began to play elaborate pieces in front of orchestras called sonatas. During the Baroque period, they would kind of have the bass section of the orchestra make up the music on the spot. So often rhythmic/bass accompaniment was given a shorthand notation to improvise behind soloists or solo sections. Not really different from the music we play nowadays, right? I have the rhythm section sort of make it up as they go along. I give them minimal notation, right, in our band. But they called this section the basso continuo, and it consisted of a harpsichord. You had basses. You had this instrument here called the viola da gamba, and occasionally kettle drums and trombones. The basso continuo played something called figured bass, which was a shorthand to make up the music behind a soloist. In many situations, that was the case. There are some very famous musicians that came out of this era. I'll talk about a couple today, and I'll play you some examples of a few of these musicians. Jean-Baptiste Lully was one of the early Baroque musicians. George Frederick Handel, who was another very famous teacher of the Baroque era. Antonio Vivaldi wrote a piece of music called The Four Seasons. Interestingly, Vivaldi taught at an all-female school, and he taught specifically orphans. So it was all-female orphans. He taught them how to play music, and to not offend famous, I think, Italians and rich Italians, he would put his orchestra of female orphans behind a big screen, so no one could tell if they were male or female. And then they would play his music. Basically, he wrote all the music for this orchestra, but his music lives on nowadays. Is pretty famous. You've probably heard it in like Hyundai commercials and things like that. Johann Sebastian Bach, who I mentioned earlier, was very famous and prolific, and he specifically wrote pieces that I want to mention called fugues. He wrote lots of different types of music, Bach did, but he's famous for fugues. He's famous for things called cantatas. He's famous for his masses. He's famous all over the board. And I want to play you some of his music really quickly before I continue. This is just a short video of one of Johann Sebastian Bach's cantatas. I'll try to give you a hyperlink in um, the actual post of this music, but this is pretty wild. You'll see the instruments that were played at the time, sort of in the setting that Bach would have performed his music. He was an organist. He played. He was a Kapellmeister, so he was in charge of the music in a certain church or cathedral in Vienna and Austria and Germany, and he wrote music for instruments that were basically for his friends. He knew all the instruments and the instrumentalists very personally. He wrote music for very, very talented people. And so people recreate this. This is a really great video of what maybe things would have looked like back in the day. It's kind of like a time machine in some way. So I'll play a couple minutes of it. Obviously, we're not going to listen to all 25 minutes of this cantata, but it's pretty wild. It's pretty cool. All right, we have the orchestra, the organs that were built during the Renaissance. Here you have oboes and things that were built in the style of the Baroque period. What's cool about this music is the instruments these folks are playing probably came from that time period. Notice, by the way, the trumpet doesn't have any valves. Man, this guy's good. Play with the feet a little bit on an organ. Some more trumpets with no valves. Man, this is really cool. I could listen to this all day. Here's an example of a fugue that I was mentioning before. The fugues are characterized by different melodies that sort of chase each other. Even just looking at this score, here's up here on the top voice, you have a certain phrase that's answered by another voice in another register, which is answered by another voice in another register, and really these fugues chase each other in time and with their melody, so it's pretty cool to hear. I'll play from the beginning, I guess. Alright, so yeah, like I was saying, Bach was very famous for his fugues, and he was famous for writing lots of different type of music too. He kind of invented this fugue style, or made it popular at least. And without further ado, The Art of the Fugue. By the way, he wrote this piece of music and to be played by any instruments, which is kind of cool. He just wrote this in a pure music sense. So something's introduced and then it's answered. Okay, so you get the point. Um, the music is very interlaced and very intricate, and it's really beautiful. And it's cool to see the score go by in real time because you can see how melodic ideas, right, are passed between an ensemble. Fugues are what Bach was very famous for, and continuing on into important technological advances, right? The piano was invented during the late Baroque period, and it was the first keyboard instrument that could play both loud and soft. The original name of the piano was the pianoforte. Over time, it gets shortened to piano. The harpsichord was a keyboard instrument that used little hooks to pluck strings, so it could only play one volume, but the piano could play multiple volumes, right, depending on how hard you hit the keys. A little hammer would hit a string. So it was advanced technology for the time, let's just say. Moving on to the classical era, this comes after the Baroque era. This era saw stylistic change, and a few of the most famous composers of all time were born in this era, and they pushed the envelope, so to speak. The era became known as the Age of Enlightenment and saw philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Rene Descartes, and even mathematician Isaac Newton. He developed his theories during this time, and he invented calculus. So gravity, right? Isaac Newton invents gravity during the classical era. The times of Europe were changing greatly too. It was a time of great political revolution, including our own, the American Revolution, and another famous revolution, the French Revolution. And the music of the time tried to reflect just radical change. It might not sound too different to us, but at the time, things were changing quickly politically in Europe and America, the Americas, I should say. And so the music was trying to reflect that. Musicians of the classical era wrote symphonies using a special form called Sonata Allegro form. A symphony, string quartet, solo sonata that uses this form to basically tells a story, and listeners of the music back in the day would come to expect certain plot developments or plot twists to happen at certain times. They listened for landmarks in the form. I like to liken this thinking to if you're listening to a piece of dubstep, some dubstep music, there's a certain time you expect the bass to drop. Well, back in the old days, they would listen, for this Sonata Allegro form to kind of play itself out. You have stability, then you have conflict, heightened tension, it develops, and at the end it comes back to the original idea, but slightly changed. And sometimes they even it's called a recapitulation, right? And sometimes they even go back to the beginning and play some of the beginning melodic ideas. So Sonata Allegro form was very common in the classical era. And probably one of the most influential musicians at the time was Mozart. He wrote hundreds of symphonies, operas, and many string quartets that get played nowadays too. 1756 to 1791. Mozart was hired by, famous people, wealthy people, wealthy families, and he worked in Vienna, Austria, Paris, Mannheim, and Munich. Haydn was another very famous teacher and a friend of Mozart, but also of Beethoven. We'll talk about those guys in a couple minutes. Haydn was also very, very prolific, and he wrote lots of music. But probably the most influential person to come out of the era was a guy named Ludwig van Beethoven. And he, with a few pieces of really famous music, ended the classical era of music, and he ushered in the Romantic era. Especially his 5th and 6th symphony, they think tells a story. And after he died, musicians became obsessed with trying to tell fantastical stories with their music. Instead of truly following the Sonata